Good afternoon and welcome, folks. Or for those on the West Coast, good morning. We'll let folks trickle in for the participants. We'll get started in just a minute here. All right, we'll go ahead and get started while folks are still trickling in. Good afternoon, good morning, boa tarde, bom dia. On behalf of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora and the Wooden Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, welcome. My name is Bryce Henson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and associate faculty in the Africana Studies program at Texas A&M. I'm also on the Oswald Executive Board and the current Social Media Committee Chair. We're all gathered here for today's event, a book talk for Visualizing Black Lives, Ownership and Control in Afro-Brazilian Media by Dr. Reagan Gillum. We hope that if you are not a member of Oswald already, that you consider joining us. Please go to our website, aswadiaspora.org. Again, that's aswadiaspora.org to find more information about us and becoming a member. FYI, our next conference will be next August 2023 in Ghana. So please come, it's a fantastic conference. You may also follow us on social media. Our handle on IG, Facebook, and Twitter is ASWA Diaspora. Again, ASWA Diaspora. And if you're tweeting during this webinar, please use the hashtags Oswald Webinar and hashtag Visualizing Black Lives. Before I introduce our featured guest today, I would like to thank the Oswald Social Media Committee, Lori Lambert, Ana Lucia Araujo, Benjamin Talton, Natasha Duncan, Ebony Jones, Taisha Maddox, Hennessy Zlata, and Angelina Soto. These events do not occur without their labor. So if you like, give them some love in the chat or with some emojis. I also like to thank the Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, especially Robert Trent Vinson, James Perla, and Deborah McDowell. They've been huge supporters of these events. James Perla in particular continues to provide tremendous support. I call him our technological backbone. Without him, these events just simply would not happen. And as I am today's moderator, I will be actually introducing our Oswald author today, who provided, I will say, the most humble bio. It is 2 sentences. Reagan Gillum is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Southern California. Her research examines the ways in which Afro-Brazilian media producers foment anti-racist visual politics through their image creations. I will just add that her work is published across Black Studies, Communication, and Anthropology journals. She just had an article come out in the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology. So please check out her work. And of course, we always have to plug the author's book, which literally comes out today. So I'm putting that in the chat box. Please check that out through University of Illinois Press, which you know for years have been doing awesome work on global Black studies, African diaspora studies, with a huge focus on Black Brazil. So this book is just one in the line of many great books. And so for today, what we'll do is I will ask Dr. Gillum a series of questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And of course, oh, the book did not show up in the chat. Oh, here we go. I appreciate that, Scholar Green. All right. the book is now there. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. When we get towards the end, we'll turn to that. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So Dr. Gillum, could you just tell us a little bit about how you came to this research topic by Afro-Brazilian media makers, and what kind of questions were guiding you as you undertook this book project?
Yes, thank you. I love this question. And before I begin, thank you so much, Bryce, to Bryce Henson for organizing this event and hosting it, and for the generous questions that you sent me. Thank you to Aswad, of course, for organizing and hosting the event. And thank you to the Woodson Institute at my alma mater, the University of Virginia. I really appreciate being here. It's really an honor to be here with everyone. And thank you to everyone who came, and to everyone who will watch the the video when it's posted. So I really appreciate this. So I came to the project by my initial interest in research in Brazil, which was from taking classes at the University of Virginia. And I took classes on Brazil, on like race and ethnicity and Blackness in Brazil with professors like David Haberly and Brian Owensby in history. And I became interested in racial ideologies in Latin America. And I became interested in this idea of like racial mixture and the kind of space that it opened up for a seeming like elasticity around racial identities. And I was interested in how it seemed very different from the United States. And so when I went to Brazil, I went to do research, and I wanted to study Black social movements because I knew that despite these ideas about this elasticity, that there were Black social movements afoot, and they were demanding rights and inclusion. And so I was interested in that. And I wondered kind of like, how do you kind of foment a politics of race in a country that doesn't necessarily believe that racial categories exist? So that was one of my initial questions. And so when I went to Brazil, I went to do these initial language learning programs, and I was living with a host mother. And part of how she suggested that I improve my Portuguese was to watch television. And that worked for me because I was an avid watcher of television in general. And so we would sit and watch, telenovelas like every night, and watch just TV, constantly. And it really did actually help to train my ear and get the cadence of the language. But I also noticed that I saw very few Black Brazilians on television. And when I would ask my host mother about it, she would kind of say, she would be kind of perplexed, like, what do you mean? We have everybody here. And I'd say, but they're not on TV. And so, I got an eyeful of Brazilian television and started to, really saw these like patterns of little representation. So while I was doing my research there and getting that preparation, the TV de Gente television network was established in 2005. And so I decided to, if I could, like make that my research project. And so I saw that as a way to kind of get at like social movements and social changes around race, but through the lens of media. So I did that. And then I went on to I wrote my dissertation on the television network. And then I went on to look at other films and videos and illustrations produced by Black Brazilians. So that's how I came to the project.
Wonderful, thank you. And one thing I always find fascinating about Brazil and Afro-Brazilian culture is that, so often the dominant representation that comes to us is that it's always really embodied and performance-based, right? So typically when we think of Afro-Brazilian culture, we think of capoeira, we think of samba, we think of candomblé, even, like futebol, right? Jogo bonito, right? And so the ironic thing is that they're almost presented as if they are antithetical to modern media and technology. And so can you just touch a little bit more on the importance of Afro-Brazilian media and the politics of visual representations there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And when I had a friend who would kind of say, like Black culture is everywhere in Brazil, Afro-Brazilian culture is everywhere, because you do see it in like samba and in capoeira, and it's in so many places. But then that hasn't necessarily translated into like power for Black Brazilians, like legislatively and in these other kinds of ways. And so I think that, you know, the politics of representation is really important because of how, you know, Afro-Brazilians have been represented in the national media. And, you know, we know, of course, that the media is this domain of power, and it, you know, has the capacity to shape like perceptions and discourses, narratives, and ideas around race and Blackness. And academics have done plenty of studies on media in Brazil, like mainly film and television. And they've shown, as I kind of said before, that Black Brazilians are not represented proportionately to their population. And when they do appear, they tend to appear in like marginal characters. And so we know that these representations kind of naturalize this idea that Afro-Brazilians are marginal. And we know that, of course, there are studies that show that there is racism in Brazil. There are these racial disparities around income and access to education and whatnot. And when the media like doesn't discuss racism or racial inequality, it tends to like leave intact this idea that this is just how things are. And so it kind of naturalizes and sediments these images. And also one thing I learned just doing the research too is that there's not a lot of Black media producers working in mainstream media and working in films. They're not necessarily, there's not like a critical mass of people in these institutions either. And then when they are, they run into other kinds of barriers in trying to change these kinds of representations. So when I talk about like Afro-Brazilian media and its importance to the politics of representation, in that much of the media that I look at is like alternative. It's produced by small groups of individuals. It's released on like YouTube and Vimeo. It's not released in like large theaters or circulating on mainstream television. But I think it's important because these protagonists, they step into this landscape of mainstream media, and they insist on telling stories around Black people's lived experiences and their lives. And I think that their media articulates this need to like shift these larger narratives about Black Brazilians. And sometimes samba and capoeira and things like that, they didn't always come in, but sometimes they did. And so they would sometimes like kind of be a backdrop, but people would really try to focus on like the stories of the characters to show like just the kind of everyday lives and struggles of Black Brazilians.
Yeah, and maybe along those lines, actually, could you talk a little bit more about why this particular like this contemporary moment, and maybe we say like over the past 10 years that we've seen a rise in independent Black media makers, especially considering the history of, you were saying earlier that, there's not a lot of Black people in mainstream media. So what is it about this moment that marks it different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, so there's been a history of, Black people Black Brazilians making their own media and films. And in the book, I look at, for example, like the Frente Negra, which was a political, like the Black Brazilian Front, which was a political group, and the Black press in São Paulo, for example. So, Black people have been trying to harness the media, for their own ends. I would say what's different about now is that I think it's the technology has become more accessible, and I think that the price has decreased. And so it's to be able to buy like a camera. And so I think that I'm seeing more people like making films, taking, photographs and things like that, and putting them on display. And I think that's part of the access to technology. But then I also think that, again, a lot of the people who I talked to had gone to college and universities to study journalism and media. And I think that now that, quotas have been in place now for quite some time, you now have a critical mass, I think, of Afro-Brazilians moving through universities too, who are then getting that like technical knowledge and being able to make films and media as part of their course of study. So some people I talked to, they made their film as like their thesis film to graduate from film school. And so, so I think more people, again, moving through those channels will increase like more films being produced. So, yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating, right? As I was reading the book, I kept thinking to myself, that, to riff off bell hooks, that, you're really kind of researching and writing about a Black oppositional gaze in Brazil. And of course, there's been Black Brazilian feminists like Lilia Gonzalez, Beatriz Nascimento, and Sueli Carneiro, who've been arguing for, a Black oppositional gaze for decades, right? But maybe you can just talk about the way that Afro-Brazilians are using media to like further develop this Black oppositional gaze against, say, Brasilidade, that, kind of at its core has this Eurocentric colonial consciousness that tries to, capture and colonize, the way, like you're saying, like ideological formations and the way people view the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And and bringing those people is key. The like Black feminists have been talking about this, in Brazil and outside of Brazil for quite some time. They've been advancing, these ideas. And, bell hooks, as you said, she has this idea of the oppositional gaze, which is like a space of agency and subjectivity. And then I also in the book talk about like another Black feminist who's Jamila Ribeiro. And she is like a philosopher and I would say an activist, and she's been quite, outspoken about Blackness and inequality. And I use her book, it's called A Small Manual of Anti-Racism. And she has this idea of like denaturalizing the gaze. And she says in the book, like, these small numbers of Black people in different spaces, like in universities and offices, on television, might seem natural to white people. But we have to denaturalize this. We have to make it seem like this is not, natural. And so I think the oppositional gaze does that. I think part of what it does is denaturalize the world as it appears to be. And it allows us to question these low numbers. And I think that much of the media that I'm looking at, it creates these, possibilities for Black representation that center Black protagonists, that tell these stories of Black people, which kind of unsettles the images of mainstream media. Because I think when we look at mainstream media, we might think, this is natural. This is how it is. This is all that it can be. And many times, like, mainstream media producers will have even said in the past, in Brazil, they've said like, well, we can't get any more Black actors because they're not trained enough. They're not, the quality's not there. They'll make all of these excuses. But I think that when you look at Afro-Brazilian media, it exposes like this media kind of as false, or these excuses as false. And the representations are not telling the whole truth. And so, and it shows like, these other, there are other possibilities. Like there are other stories that could be told. There's no reason why, you can't tell these other stories. And so, and I think Afro-Brazilian media like materializes that argument. And one person I talk about in the book as an example is Zosimo Bol, who's he was a director. And he made several films, but one of the films was called Alma no Olho, or Soul in the Eye. He made another film called Abolition, or Abolição. And Abolition was a documentary in 1988, and it commemorated the 100th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in Brazil, which was in, of course, 1888, the last country to abolish slavery. And so he made this documentary, and he interviews all of these different everyday people, experts, and basically the part of what he's communicating in the documentary is that much has not actually changed since abolition to then 1988. And so I think this is like an oppositional gaze where he's countering the celebrations of the centennial, and he's saying he's kind of questioning like, well, what are we celebrating? So he always brings that like critical lens. And so he's just, you know, again, one example of, I think, this oppositional gaze and how it circulates through media in like documentaries, images, films, all these ways.
Right. And maybe you could talk just a little bit more about, you know, what kind of representations are these Afro-Brazilian media makers pressing up against, right? Maybe for those who aren't familiar with Brazil, you know, what, you know, especially with the way the racial democracy mythology, you know, circulates, you know, why, you know, basically why is there a need for Afro-Brazilian media makers to challenge how the way they are represented in mainstream media?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to, much of the, like I said, much of the, there's a whole, you know, area of literature where scholars kind of dissect different programs, and they look at, you know, usually if there's like a Black character, you know, they'll look at the character, how it's positioned, what, you know, what the meanings are that circulate around it, what's being communicated about, you know, race with those characters. And they tend to again, like, not really talk about racism ever. So it's as if, you know, racism does not exist. The many Black characters will be in like interracial relationships and marry white partners, like as a general rule, which then again, like, tends to align with these ideas of like racial mixture, and not just that, but like the cordiality of, you know, of race relations. And that it's, you know, it just foments this idea that everything is harmonious, and race relations are, again, like very cordial. Like we don't have racism. So anyone can marry anyone. It's fine, you know. And all of this sediments these ideas of, you know, of racial democracy, right? Which is the idea that that generally the Brazilian population is racially mixed, that because of that, there is no defining line between, you know, racial groups. And because there's not really a defining line, then how can you determine, you know, racism or discrimination like based solely on race when you don't have race, right? So that it's this whole, you know, logic that you know, people will employ. And then there can be like silences around race where people don't talk about racism, and it's almost as if it doesn't exist. And then when people do make claims like this is racism, people might say, well, no, it's not. How can you? There is no racism, you know, because we don't have that. So there's these constant struggles around like what constitutes racism, what constitutes race, and Blackness, and all the while, you know, researchers are also finding that, you know, no, but like if you look at people of African descent and you look at their sheer like levels of income, how many are in universities, you know, how many are living in the periphery, who's getting killed by the police, you know, we know that, you know, there are these racial inequality, you know, does exist. So I think racial democracy can like mask these very real disparities around race. And so then the media, it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't always help, right? It doesn't like when I was in Brazil, like in 2007, there was one telenovela, for example, and this is relatively common, where there was a Black woman character and she was a maid. And so again, this is very common to see Black women as maids on television, or then other Black people as like service workers. I saw someone put in the chat, or enslaved, right? And so, you know, usually if you're watching a telenovela set historically, they're, you know, it's usually like during slavery. So you have to have Black characters and they're usually enslaved. So you get these very like limited slices of representation. And even the way that slavery is represented, it's very innocuous. It's almost, you know, they don't really go into the horrors of slavery. So much of this, again, it just kind of maintains these ideas of cordiality. And then Liv Sovic writes about how Brazilian media is also a way to basically represent like whiteness. And she has an article called like Whiteness in the Brazilian Media, and how and people have argued this as well, that within these ideas of racial mixture, they're, you know, streaming towards whiteness. Like whiteness is what's prioritized, and you can see that prioritization in the mainstream media through the kind of the heavy representation of, you know, white characters and the centrality of white characters in the media. So that's the general sort of overview of the mainstream media. And I do think there are these moments when other shows do emerge. I don't want to say that it's completely just, you know, one way. And there are, like, you know, different, a show will kind of appear, and that might be more refreshing, and then it'll end. But overall, the literature really emphasizes these problems with Black representation.
That's one thing I really adore about this book, is that, you know, like you said, so much of the literature has been about, you know, the way mainstream representations have reinforced the racial democracy ideology and mythology, but also at the same time make, you know, the structural racism invisible. And, you know, and again, folks, get this book. It's in the chat. I'll drop it again. But, you know, you're really working through these multi-layered networks, right, of power between structural racism, media, and Afro-Brazilian activism. And so I find this really fascinating for two reasons, because, you know, one, so often, you know, my students, they always say, well, you know, to counter the negative representations, we just need positive ones, right? Like, you can just come in and replace them, right? Not knowing that, you know, you can also, you know, positive representations can also be controlling images, right? And then the second is that we tend to ignore overall, I think, the importance of media and activism, right? That, you know, media provides us a symbolic and ideological terrain to struggle over as well, beyond, you know, in addition to the social and political. And, you know, you pull these together in your, you know, very nuanced ways with your concept of anti-racist visual politics. And so can you just tell the audience, you know, and folks in excuse me, can you tell the audience, you know, where and how do you approach these, you know, multi-layered social and political forces that are converging together with Afro-Brazilian media makers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. That's great. And I hear the same as well about like the positive and the negative images. And then also there tends to be an emphasis on like stereotypes, and like everything is a stereotype. And like everything is, you know, then maybe bad or negative. And so it's like, well, then like, what is a nuanced image? What is a complex image? And I think that can be up for debate, you know, as well. But for the context, I use the term anti-racist visual politics as a term that I'm trying to use to thread together the whole book. And so I'm sure, as people know who have written books or who are in the process of writing books, you have to have like an overarching argument to hold it all together, which can be, for me, was difficult to come up with. But I came up with this because I thought, I thought about this media in the context in which I was doing the research. So when I went to Brazil, this was kind of the early 2000s, about 2004 until like 2013, but even beyond that. There was a lot of debate around and public discussion around racial politics, and particularly around like affirmative action, which is called, of course, quotas in Brazil, and this law 10.639. So there was so much discussion around affirmative action or holding spaces for Black Brazilians in higher education, but not just Black Brazilians, but also like poor Brazilians and indigenous Brazilians, right? Like making higher education accessible to those who had been excluded. And people were, I mean, there were these debates in universities, debates in the newspaper, even some debates on television a little bit, but people were arguing, you know, that of course quotas should happen because higher education has been so closed off from Afro-Brazilians, and how are they supposed to, you know, ascend economically if they can't access it? And then others, of course, would say, no, we should not have, you know, affirmative action because it's not appropriate for a country like Brazil that doesn't have, you know, racial categories. And there were, of course, other reasons as well that people would debate, but there was a lot of discussion. And then there was also law 10.639, which was developed in I think 3. And this required Afro-Brazilian history and culture to be taught in schools and taught in primary schools, like in public schools. And so teachers were being trained on how to teach Afro-Brazilian history and culture. And I went to some of these trainings. And again, these were like spaces of incredible debate about not just like what should be taught, but even like why they needed to teach it in the first place. Because again, people in these trainings would say, well, we don't need these trainings because we don't have racism. So there were all of these, just discussions around race at the time. And so my point in saying this is that I thought that media producers were also tapping into this energy and all of this discussion at the time, and they were kind of channeling it through media production. And I thought, again, there's all of these discussions around like anti-racism and how it should occur, particularly in education. I thought that media producers were channeling these discussions about how they also could contribute to anti-racism. And so anti-racist visual politics is a framework that, again, like I said, holds the book together, but it's like how media producers like identify, challenge, and break with like racist practices and ideologies. And so I argue that like media producers are fomenting anti-racism in 3 ways. One of the ways is that they insist on representing racism. So they insist on there are all of these depictions about racism and about how it occurs. It's realities, how they experience it just in their everyday lives. So that's one of the ways, and of course this is important in a country that has denied or downplayed racism for so long. And so they're kind of saying this is exactly how racism happens to me as I experience it. Another way that they like foment anti-racism is that I argue that just by demanding to have access to the camera, right, demanding to have access to the tools of representation, they are, again, like asserting the right to participate in and control media and control representation. And like I said, there are small numbers of Black Brazilians in the industry, and they are asserting their right, like we have the right to be here and to participate in the production of these programs. And then in the last way is that, I say that they insist on making images that are like complex representations of Blackness. And so, and one of the ways they do this is producing like representations that are, I would say, faithful to the lives of Black Brazilians. They center Black protagonists. They center like their feelings, their emotions, their experiences. And when you have, Black protagonists, like you have to follow their story. You become invested in them as a character, as an audience. And so, their conflicts, their, journeys are prioritized in the programming. And, characters have like interior lives, they have families, communities. And so in this way, they kind of endow these characters with subjectivity. And I argue that they're kind of demanding to like ascribe meaning to Black identities or ascribe meaning to their own identities. So, again, it's a kind of like self-determination, right? Like the mainstream media doesn't, and the producers there, they've been producing these representations for so long that we've just talked about, and they're saying, well, we have a right to determine like what Blackness means and what how characters are represented. And part of I look at a different literature in thinking about this, but one of the people was Kristen Warner and her idea of like plastic representation, and she talks about how usually like she's talking about kind of colorblind characters, and when you put Black characters in characters that aren't written for any kind of race, then there's like this lack of depth of the character, and you get these kind of, again, she calls them plastic representations. So I include her, and she helped me to like just think about what I think these media producers are doing in Brazil is they're adding breadth and depth and complexity to these characters, to show these like different facets of life that you really don't generally see otherwise in mainstream media.
Yeah, and one thing that you're talking about this shift, Black Brazilians demanding to be subjects rather than objects and defining their own stories. And one thing that I noticed throughout the book, and this also probably, not probably, I'm certain this is probably related to the fact that so many of these folks have gone to college, have been, through the quota system. So the way you talk about race and racism in media is also related to class and class differences, right? And I think there's something about folks are trying to say that also Black Brazilians are not a monolith, right? So could you just, kind of touch upon some of the nuances and contradictions between race and class in Afro-Brazilian media?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this I think came out mainly in one of the parts in chapter 2 when I talk about TV da Gente, or I translate it to Our TV. And this was a television network started in 2005 with the idea of representing Black Brazilians, like that was its goal. And so one of the things they did when I talked to them was I asked the producers, who they wanted to show in the network, in the television programs, because that was, like I said, that was like my first sort of foray into this project. And I wondered, well, what would people show if they had the resources and the relative freedom to produce their own programs? And so many people said, oh, we wanted to show like professional lawyers, doctors, people making a difference in their communities. But there was this really strong emphasis on, like I said, professional workers, and I would say like middle class people. And many of the shows would be a show with like a host, and they'd be interviewing someone. And I would even say the hosts themselves represent like this professional, character, I guess, or this professional stature. So one of the hosts, for example, was a man named Dr. Egio Silva, who's a lawyer, a politician, he's very prominent in São Paulo, or probably in the country in general. And he was a host of one of the shows, for example. And so, he himself is like an example of this like professional middle class image on the show. And so I'm arguing that this emphasis on like middle-class professionals troubles this idea that like money whitens in Brazil. And because again, I talked about like this elasticity of racial categories. There's the idea that with economic ascension, one can sort of opt out of Blackness, right? Like you don't have to say that you're Black. And in a way, people think also like, well, if money whitens, then in a way, like you're not Black because you are economically ascendant. And so I talk about like some of the contradictions with this idea, right? It doesn't really think about, maybe why Black people might be in a lower economic realm in the first place. They don't think about why this is. But also the idea of middle class in general in Brazil is constructed around whiteness. And so, and I use different, historical studies to think about this, but there's a woman named Angela Figueiredo, who's I think a sociologist, and she talks about how Afro-Brazilian middle classes, like when they're shopping, for example, they feel out of place. So when Afro-Brazilians do reach like middle class status, again, because middle class is actually structured around whiteness, middle class Black people may, feel this discomfort or feel out of place in inhabiting this racial category. So my point in the book is that I think by insisting on this image of a Black middle class professional worker, it insists on the existence of this category. It says like middle class Black people exist and they are still Black, right? By virtue of putting them on this network that's aim is to show Blackness. And I think it's not to necessarily say like this is all of Black Brazilians, but I think it adds like, again, one more subject position to show this range of, multiplicity that people, that people inhabit, and that it's not necessarily out of the ordinary, like they too contain multitudes, and have just as much of a right to inhabit, the position of a lawyer, as any other, as any other position.
I'm gonna ask you one last question. And to the folks getting in the audience, I see we already have 4 questions lined up. After this question, we'll go to Q&A. And so if you have any pressing questions, please drop them there. And so the last question I'll ask you for now is, one thing I absolutely adored was your citational practices. As many of us know, citations are inherently political. And I think, for you and I who are kind of working across anthropology, media studies, and Black studies, we've really seen these movements like Cite Black Women and #ComSoWhite. So one thing I appreciate is you do your reader a tremendous favor by providing an up-to-date review of scholarship on racism and media in Brazil. And then secondly, you really emphasize, one thing I noticed is there's really this huge emphasis on Black scholars in Brazil, those who are writing in Portuguese, those who aren't translated into English yet, as well as Black scholars in the United States. So could you just kind of give us a reflection on the politics of citation? And what were you trying to do conveying your own citational practices?
Yeah, thank you so much for noticing that. And I think this question is so important because citation is important as a conversation in for academics. It's an important form of recognition. Many Black scholars, Black women just get left out of the conversation that's enacted through citation. So, we know that citation is political, and the work that, like you said, like Cite Black Women and the collective with Kristen Smith and the collective of people working in that, and the ComSoWhite hashtag is really doing, incredible work in elevating these issues and making this awareness, and so also in doing the work in Brazil, like you said, you have to cite Brazilian scholars. There are colleagues, and they're also doing this work. They're also contributing. So, if it's a conversation, then they're included in it as well. And so one thing I was trying to do with the bibliography is I was trying to build as robust a bibliography as I could on race and media in Brazil, race, media, and Blackness in Brazil, to include, Brazilians, Afro-Brazilian researchers, Black scholars. And one of the people who I got this from was Nicole Siegel, I think she's at University of Indiana. And I remember when I took a class with her at Cornell, because she was a fellow there. And she told me that she is in favor of a robust bibliography. And I like that idea. And one of the things that she told me was that I needed to, she told me I needed to cite Brazilians, right? So she very early on told me that. And then I was also again, early in grad school, when I was trying to build my bibliography, and I couldn't find a lot of research on race, media, and Blackness in Brazil. And I would notice, of course, I would look at the United States, and I would look at work here on race, media, and Blackness, and there was much more of a critical mass. And so I was kind of looking for that in Brazil, and I couldn't always find it. So she told me that what I needed to do was look at work, produced in Brazil by Brazilians. And at that time, the journals were not all digitized. So the Brazilian journals were not digitized. And so I was lucky that my library had, maybe 5 different journals from Brazil, communication studies journals, media studies journals. It had Estudos Afro-Asiáticos, which is a race and ethnicity journal in Brazil. And so I remember taking several weeks to go physically through these journals. I pulled each one off the shelf and just paged through them, looking at the table of contents, and then writing down the citations and photocopying the articles that I could find and developing a bibliography from that. And I still have those, and I cite them in the book. And so I found people like Solange Coceira Lima and just other Joel Zito Araújo, his earlier work was in there, among others. And that's how I built like a early bibliography about like race and Blackness and media. And that was like what I then relied on. And then when I went to Brazil, I would of course go to libraries and go to bookstores and just like, scan through the books and looking for, again, more work, anything I could find, I would buy. I would do that every year. And then, and eventually I was like able to build up this, body of work. And so, and now there's more, there's like more research, which is great. But yeah, so that's just one story. But I think it's really important to, to cite these people, to find this work. And I try to include work in a way like as far back as I can, but also updated, like as recent as I can, to show that like these are longstanding conversations. People have been working on this, and and these are debates that people have been invested in for some time. So those are some of the things I was trying to do with bibliography.
Wonderful. I'm laughing because I have the same experiences as far as, you try to get the sources however you can. I remember having to ask a friend at Stanford if they get me an article that Beatriz Nascimento, the one on O Conceito de Quilombo, because only 3 libraries in all the United States had it, and I wasn't getting Brazil anytime soon. And so, yeah, I mean, and part of this question is recognizing that, building a robust bibliography is like an invisible labor, right? It shows up in the end, but it takes a lot of work to do that, particularly, what's available to here in the United States. So I just want to make sure that that labor is recognized, and, for other folks to hear that as well. We'll go ahead and transition to the Q&A. And I'm actually, some of these seem like they're kind of linked. So I'm gonna pull a few together, actually, if folks don't mind. So we have Antonio Junião. It says, nowadays, the alternative medias in Brazil, Black and Indigenous principally, have been publishing stories that mainstream media in Brazil don't like to talk about. Cases about violences of race, gender, and class, mass incarceration, grassroots movement struggle are highlighted more nowadays, and has been showing other cultural perspectives to solve problems, and educate people in a disruptive way. Even with the difference of economic power between the mainstream and alternative media, these news media outlets are doing a very interesting job. I would like to know if Professor Reagan Gillum knows some of the outlet medias from Brazil, such as Alma Preta, Ponte Jornalismo, Correio Nago, Nós Mulheres da Periferia, and others. Thank you. And then I'm also going to combine that with Scholar Simone's comments. Are there any Black Brazilian filmmakers and media makers you encourage us to engage with?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Those are really important, and I do follow Alma Preta for sure, and I think I didn't catch some of the other Ponte Jornalismo, yes, and yes. So some of those I do follow, and I think that they're really important because they're giving that kind of critical, like you say in the question, they're giving that critical lens and perspective on current, and everyday things that are happening in Brazil, and they're really looking like on the ground, right? And they look at like different events that are being commemorated. Like I just saw something recently about the Modern Art Week and how it's being commemorated in São Paulo in particular, and and there are all of these like events around it. And then again, when I look at that critical Black media perspective, they talk about how, well, actually the Modern Art Week didn't really include many Black Brazilian artists or any, and they talk about the exclusions in the Modern Art Week. So again, and this goes back to this, oppositional gaze, like it continues, to the present day. And I think that those people are doing the like everyday work of, journalism for like Black communities and for these kinds of issues. I see a little bit more of the issues like coming into the mainstream press. And again, I look mainly in São Paulo, so like the press there, but it's not a critical mass, right? It's not that much in a way that these other organs that you talk about are like really filling that void. And I think that that's really important. And then the question about Black Brazilian filmmakers and media makers. Yeah, so Netflix has become kind of a place, I think, where there's a lot more diversity representation in the US, but also for Brazil. They have a lot of Brazilian content, and you can see a lot of different visions of Brazil from there. And many of the people producing them many of them are Brazilian. Like it's not like people in the United States producing for Brazil. They're Brazilian film companies. And one person I know is Juliana Vicente, and she is a Afro-Brazilian woman director. And I talk about in the book her film, it's called Colors and Boots, and you can actually find that on YouTube. It's Colors and Boots or Cores e Botas. And it's a short film. It's a great film. But she also has a series on Netflix that's called Afronta, or Face It. And it's basically these like short videos of a lot of Afro-Brazilian cultural producers. And she's kind of interviewing them about their life stories, the kind of work that they produce, their singers, graffiti artists, filmmakers as well. They are doing all kinds of like I said, artists, and it's this series. Like I said, it's on Netflix. It's called Afronta, and you can see there, she's kind of bringing you another body of Black cultural producers and what they're doing in Brazil. So those are two places where I would start.
Wonderful. And again, folks in the audience, I'm skipping around just a little bit, but I see everyone's questions, so please don't feel like I'm skipping you. Next, we have Scholar Osai. Hi, Reagan. Thank you and Bryce for this wonderful dialogue. Since your work is situated in the context of São Paulo, I was wondering if you could discuss how the media and historical landscape is distinct from Rio de Janeiro or Salvador. The Frente Negra Brasileira began in São Paulo and Abdias Nascimento, then known for his work in TEN, based in Rio, or the Teatro Experimental Negro, was deeply informed by his experiences in the São Paulo state interior. What does the São Paulo context bring to the larger significance of Black Brazilian studies?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I've been recently writing more about São Paulo and Blackness. And so I've been thinking about this a lot recently. And as Bryce said in the beginning, I published an article in the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology on Blackness in São Paulo, and the article is called Latent Blackness. And I also published another article in the Journal of Global Studies on São Paulo as well. And so I think that São Paulo is, it's the city of that's said to be, the city of like modernity in Brazil. And again, I'm saying this, like, this is all like discursively. It's not that other cities are not modern, right? But that's the designation on São Paulo. And it's kind of a place known for like business and industry. And I think it's in a way like New York City, where it's like a place where it's like people go to kind of make things happen in a way. And so when I would talk to people in São Paulo about the media they were producing, they would say sometimes like, well, if we can't make it happen in São Paulo, then where can we make it happen? And that's, I think, kind of ironic, because really, I think Salvador is known to be the center of Blackness in Brazil, just nationally. And people would always ask me too, like, oh, you want to study Blackness in Brazil? Why are you going to São Paulo? Like, why don't you go to Salvador? You're like in the wrong place. But I think also people don't know that São Paulo has, in sheer numbers, the largest in sheer numbers of Black population. Salvador has the larger percentage of Black people, but São Paulo is not, it's not, there's a large, constituency there. And then, like you said, there's this deep, history of Black politics in São Paulo too. So I think that São Paulo, in a way, is kind of like an seemingly unlikely place for Black media. But I think it's I think it's a good place. I think that in some of the media, you see people really trying to also talk about like Blackness in Sao Paulo. So people will bring like, again, not that these things don't exist elsewhere, but they'll talk about like spatial absences of Blackness in Sao Paulo. They'll go to neighborhoods that were historically Black neighborhoods, but now are not known to be, people don't know that these were historically Black neighborhoods. And so, they'll go there and, they'll kind of show these Black stories happening there to, in a way, like reclaim these spaces. People will talk about, of course, like hip hop in Sao Paulo, and that will be like a very central theme in the media. But yeah, I think that Sao Paulo is definitely a kind of a character in the book too. And also I think the fact that, again, there's this pretty large, again, like a large like Black professional class in Sao Paulo as well. I think that that's part of what informs then those themes that I talked about earlier in the in the media. So I think Sao Paulo is definitely a character here. And like I said, I've been thinking more about Sao Paulo and Blackness quite a bit. And I think it can be thought to be like an unlikely place, but then when you look further, you see that there's so much there.
Great. And as someone who does work in and on Bahia, all my friends from Sao Paulo are like, no. Sao Paulo is the Blacker city. We have more Black. So, Black Paulistanos make sure that there's a Black Sao Paulo, and it's very important. Moving on to the next question. I'm actually going to pair these. I feel like these again are kind of similar from Scholar Green and Scholar King. But first, what parallels and glaring differences do you notice between African-American media representations in the US and Afro-Brazilian media representations? Also, do you notice any Afro-Latina feminism trends being revealed in Afro-Brazilian media? And then Scholar King, does US American racism influence or inform the stereotypes of Blackness in Brazil? If so, how does it show up?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So I think that the question about I'll take this question about like similarities between the US and Brazil, and this question of like, how does US racism show up in the media. So one thing I look at is in the television network called, again, TV de Gente, or Our TV. Part of the inspiration for that network was Black entertainment television in the United States, and people said this to me again when I asked them. And I said, well, why did you want to start a television network? And they said, oh, well, we looked at your country and you have Black television networks there. And so that was, again, part of the inspiration. There were other ideas as well, but people, had this knowledge of Black television in the United States, and they would reference it. They also knew that there was, at least and at the time, and probably now, I don't know about now, but there was probably more Black representation in the US than in Brazil. And so people would say that. They would say, well, we watched this show, in the United States. And so we know that there are these possibilities, and that, there are possibilities for like Black shows. And so this isn't in the book, but the show Everybody Hates Chris was very popular at the time when I was doing research. And Everybody Hates Chris, it shows like racism, and it has like a critical take on racism, and people would talk about that with me in Brazil. So it wasn't that people wanted to necessarily replicate exactly African-American programming in the US. They weren't thinking, oh, let's make an Everybody Hates Chris in Brazil, or even like, let's just take Black entertainment television and make it in Brazil. It was really just the idea, like, oh, there are these programs, there are these, there's a network, this is possible. So, let's do that. Let's do that here. And then but of course people would have their own stories and their own programming and their own ideas for themes that they would produce in the programming that were, of course, very Brazilian. They were not at all, taking cues of content from the United States. And then with feminism, I think that in the last chapter, I actually talk about Black girls. Black children. And there's a lot of emphasis on in people's films on Black girls. And even more than, I see a lot of films with Black girls as protagonists. And there's even other films even beyond in my book. There's like this constant like Black girl protagonist. And so I think that part of what they're doing is they're kind of presenting these like coming of age narratives that show that developing a consciousness of race is part of coming of age, and in these narratives, and that, you know, in order to have like a Black critical consciousness going forward, the children have to, you know, develop this consciousness, and these films tend to show like girls usually encountering some kind of form of racism. It's usually aesthetic, and it's usually involving their hair. And then they have to sort of come to a reevaluation of themselves and, you know, accept themselves as they are. And in the process, you know, again, gaining like a greater consciousness so that they can move forward as like kind of fortified girls to then become like Black women, right? So that was a theme in many of the films, and I think that answers that question about like possible, you know, the subject of feminism and in these issues of like gender and also youth in the media.
And I think that's actually a good segue to, and I think we can actually again tie these the last two questions together. The first from Scholar Baruti, referencing your comments about TV da Gente and elevation of professional representations. Did you follow the 2014 controversy around the TV show Sexo e a Negras? And if so, can you share your reflections? And then also by Scholar Smith, whose question is, Brazil, like many places around the world, has made a radical cultural shift over the past 20 years, moving quickly from ignoring and or devaluing Blackness in the media to centering it and appropriating it widely. One place this is clearly visible is in Brazilian reality TV, particularly Big Brother, and also Carnival was this week. Can you discuss some of the recent shifts in Black cultural representation in Brazilian media and how they're also changing the landscape of visualizing Blackness?
Yeah, thank you. And those are definitely tied together. I don't think I don't remember enough about the Sexo e as Negras, but to make a commentary. I'm sure I had a commentary at the time that it happened, but I'd have to like go back and look at it to be able to say anything, I think, of like anything useful at this point. But this question of like contemporary, you know, representations, I think the media has changed so much. And I think some of it is definitely this like constant appropriation. And I think that's like a constant, you know, theme in Brazil, as Professor Smith, you know, would know, and in her writings, where, you know, the nation is sort of constantly trying to appropriate Black culture, you know, for its own uses, but I think that Black people are also constantly trying to like, you know, wrestle it away. And you know, of course, there's been writing about like how samba and carnival are kind of appropriated, and I think people have written about how, in a way, it's been like these places have been evacuated of their capacity for resistance. But I'm not always like convinced about that, because I think, like, as you said, like with Carnival, I think, so this week also, was it like, because I know they haven't had Carnival for the past, because of the pandemic, but I think it was like 3 years ago, there was a Carnival performance where they were showing like slavery in the float, like in the parade. And this was like really, you know, explosive. And I remember bringing this into my class, and that, I think that school did win. And I remember we had this discussion about, like, you know, is there no capacity for resistance in, you know, in this, like in showing these scenes of slavery? You know, is this an attempt to like take back Carnival and make it a place of like, and insist on like, you know, Blackness and Black stories, and what does that mean? So I think it's like this constant, you know, tugging, you know, back and forth. And then also, in the changing landscape too, I've seen too some of the people who I interviewed and did research with, like in the past, one of the great things has just been seeing people like, they just keep going and keep doing more. So Mauricio Pastana, for example, was someone who I interviewed, and I include him in the book, like his illustrations and how he has these kind of like ironic and satirical illustrations about racism, but you would find them like in his books. And now I think he's a commentator on CNN in Brazil. So I see like him, you know, moving more into the mainstream. I see, like I said earlier, like Juliana Vincenci, like she's moving more into the mainstream and like showing, you know, Netflix. And then the last person I'll say is there's a film called A Cabeça de Negro, and it's by Deo Cardoso, who's the director. And this film it's really great. It's about this school in the Northeast, and he brings like Black power into it. And basically he shows like the student and these students kind of protesting the conditions of their school, of their, like, it's like literally looking kind of at structural racism and the conditions of the school, and how, and students like kind of protest and bring attention to this, to these issues. And the film, like I said, is A Cabeça de Negro, or I've seen it translated to A Bretta's Mind. But anyway, my point is that I think that there's a lot more coming out, and I'm a fan of this. I'm a fan of like Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom. But I think that you see these like struggles with appropriation, but I also think that people are also like trying to produce like more, you know, critical images too. And I think that that's, to me, like that's one of the hopes, right? Is that you can like see this multiplicity, because as we know, when there's so little, the burden on that one becomes so great that, you know, and one thing cannot show, it can't show this multiplicity. So yeah, I'm actually excited to see. I think that you know, there's so much, like such a rich cultural heritage and historical heritage of Afro-descendant people in Brazil, that I actually think we're in a way scratching the surface, and there's going to be so much more to come.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to go ahead and end it there. We're about 10 minutes in the Central Time Zone past 1 o'clock. I know 2 o'clock, it's about 2:10 on the East Coast. Let's all give Dr. Reagan Gillum a round of applause. Thank you so much. It's been informative. I'm also dropping the book in the chat one last time. Make sure you get yourself a copy. And again, thank you, and have a great rest of your week, everybody.
Thank you so much.